Thanks, everyone. Yes, my name is Elizabeth Shoshany Anderson, and I want to start off by saying a big thank you to Doug for doing, and everyone else involved with the Conney for doing this wonderful event and for allowing me to participate in it. I'm thrilled. So the title of my talk is called Positioning Pluralism, the Jewish Museum of Casablanca and the Display of Moroccan Judaism. Do we have the... Perfect. You can see here the Jewish cemetery in Marrakesh. So Morocco, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is a country of religious pluralism that has a very unique Jewish heritage. And currently, it is the only Jewish museum in the Arabic world, has the only Jewish museum in the Arabic world. So I'm going to talk about that museum a little bit and focus on the phenomenon of cultural tourism and commercialized nostalgia through the legacy of Moroccan Jewish art. And I'll also be briefly talking about the role of government and monarchy in post-colonial Moroccan art museums and how that contributes to a formation of national identity. Museums in Morocco and beyond are, as I'm sure we would all agree, of vital importance to understanding identity, art, religion, belonging. And the complicated history of Jewish art in Morocco really shows us the role and perception of the Jewish community in the country. Next slide. So I'm just going to give you a really brief overview of the history of very brief overview of the history of Moroccan Jews until the 20th century, and it's helpful to understand sort of the history of Jewish Moroccan art objects. So Jews have been in Morocco since ancient times. Some estimate the year 70 in the Common Era, and they have lived largely autonomously, many times in what were called mellas, which were Jewish quarters close to the king's palaces. In various cities throughout Morocco, and they worked as court Jews, as bankers, and primarily and largely as artisans. And they also had achieved something called zimis, which is like a protected person status. So that held obviously protection, but also they had to pay protection taxes. They had quite a few restrictive laws enacted on their populations. So all this to say, kind of a very broad overview of Jews in Morocco until the 20th century is that they lived under extremely variable conditions, and it depended pretty much ruler to ruler and city to city, and so things were very turbulent. Next. We see here two beautiful examples of the kind of intricate work in the Moroccan Jewish metalsmithing tradition. Moroccan Jewish artisans used filigree, the fine metal work around the outside, as well as niello, which is an inlaying and engraving technique introduced by Spanish Jews in the 14th and 15th centuries. So restriction of Jewish economic activity in Morocco at large in the 16th and 17th centuries really led to increased occupational specialization, as I mentioned before, moneylending, trade, and artistry. And as in Europe, Jews were some of the only people who were allowed to become moneylenders, and also this brought them into proximity with precious metals. And so the Jews, for quite a few centuries, had a near monopoly on jewelry smithing and the spinning of fine metallic threads used in brocades and tapestries. Muslim Moroccans in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries often saw shaping of precious metals and selling them above their intrinsic value of the weight of the metal as equal to usury, something that Jews were also accused of as moneylenders. So the ability to use fire to shape metals and clay was seen as sorcery many times and led to mistrust and suspicion of Jewish jewelers, and the association of the Jewish community with artistry and with the craftsmanship of metals, such as these, really contributed to a continued ostracization from general society. So this is the outside of the Jewish Museum of Casablanca. As you can see, it does not indicate much. This is what's the street view on the far left here. It just has a sign that says museum. And the building was constructed in 1948, and it was always used by the Jewish community of Casablanca. And the seclusion, as you may well guess, is for security reasons. It's guarded under surveillance, pretty standard for Jewish institutions in the Arabic world. So the Jewish Museum of Casablanca was established in 1997 with the support of the Foundation of Jewish Moroccan Cultural Heritage, which was recognized by the government of Abderrahman El Youssefi in 2001, which gave it legal status, so it's legally recognized. And as in any museum, the objects on display and the exhibitions on display in the Jewish Museum of Casablanca are not objective, right? They're working towards creating a narrative past through exhibitions, which any museum does. And this museum relies on local memory, again, as I think most museums do, especially ethnographic museums, which is complicated, however, in this case, because which I will discuss in a minute, but the mass migration of Jews from Morocco to Israel in the second half of the 20th century really means that there's a huge loss of presence of Jewish communities in Morocco today. So relying on local memory becomes a complicated matter when there really isn't a local memory present. So many events of the Jewish community of Morocco during the 20th century are not recorded or alluded to in any way in the Jewish Museum of Casablanca. But the building does have one large room for exhibitions, 3 small galleries, a replica Moroccan synagogue, and a library. The objects on display are artistic, historical, religious, traditional in nature. And the state, as I sort of alluded to when I mentioned the legal status, does partially finance the Jewish Museum of Casablanca. However, the role of the Moroccan government in supporting the Jewish Museum of Casablanca does not include overt support. So the museum's not listed on the Ministry for Culture's website or available print materials. And Omar Baum, who's a great scholar, does a lot of work on Jewish-Moroccan relations, and who I'll quote again in this presentation, calls this the official state backgrounding of Jewish museum and state support of Jewish cultural institutions. So they kind of they do support these institutions, but not overtly, not super publicly. However, King Mohammed VI, the current ruler of Morocco, did attend the opening of the renovation of the Jewish Museum in 2011, and additionally for an exhibition of Jewish Moroccan art at the Jewish Museum here in New York in 2000. The king provided an official statement for the catalog by Vivian Mann, excellent catalog, and in the statement he showed support, and he spoke of the Jewish community's importance to the history of Morocco, and said the quote, which is something you hear again and again when you talk about Moroccan people about the Jewish community, which is Jews in Morocco are a remarkable experience of tolerance of our time. That's the keyword, tolerance. We have no Jews in Morocco, only Moroccan citizens. Next slide, please. A very quick timeline of modern Moroccan Judaism. So the 20th century saw radical change for the Moroccan Jewish community, as most Jewish communities worldwide. 1912 saw the creation of the French Protectorate in Morocco, and under French rule in Morocco, Jews had to be naturalized to become citizens, French citizens. So this was very difficult for a lot of Jews. They often had to lie about their place of birth, but it created further division with the Muslim population of the country because Muslim Moroccans were not allowed to become French citizens. So it was difficult for Jews, but it was possible, but it was impossible for Muslims. So in 1930, the Jewish population of Morocco estimated 225,000 people. During the colonial era, the Jewish population grew to over 280,000 people by 1947, which anytime you think about the Jewish population in Morocco, obviously it was more than it is today, but it was always a small segment of the population. And in 1939, World War II begins, and the Jews of French Morocco are governed by Vichy French rule, as is all of Morocco. And some Moroccan Jews were sent to labor camps, and in 1941, the Vichy government enacted very overt anti-Jewish legislation, and there was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment towards the end of the war, sort of pogrom-style raids and protests and things like that. 1943, the Vichy government collapses. 1948, State of Israel was founded, and that began a mass exodus of Moroccan Jews to Israel. It left a huge hole in Moroccan society and economy. As I mentioned, Moroccan Jews played a large role in cultural and economic activity in the country. 1956, Morocco achieved independence, and it's estimated that about 280,000, so almost all the Jews that were there mid-century, left Morocco during this decade. And between 1967 to 1970, and that time period, an estimated 4,000 Jews left annually for Israel. In 1999, Mohammed VI, who I mentioned before, ascended the throne. He's the current ruler of Morocco. And in 2019, there are fewer than 3,000, and some say that's a larger estimate than is the real case, left in Morocco, mostly in Casablanca and Fez. And in Israel today, there are nearly 500,000 Jews of Moroccan origin. And Omar Baum, who I quoted earlier, kind of discusses a generational divide between how Jews are seen in Morocco. So he says that older generations in Morocco often discuss the absence of Jews with nostalgia and sadness. They long for the time when there were more Jews in the marketplace and, creating artwork. And then some Muslim Moroccans share that nostalgia. Some Muslim Moroccans also, obviously it's not a monolithic culture, but some do demonize Jews, associate them with Israel, Zionism, and see Jews as political spies. next. So, as I mentioned before, a lot is not included in the Jewish Museum of Casablanca. The mission of the Jewish Museum of Casablanca is to allude to and respect a specific Moroccan Jewish identity, but it does not include any content that references the Holocaust at all, not how it happened in Europe or how it affected Moroccan Jews. And this could be seen as giving primacy to Moroccan Jewish experience, as most Moroccan Jews were not directly involved in the Holocaust or really affected as much as European Jews, or obviously it could be seen as an idealization of history and an omission of controversial topics. The founding director of the JMC, Simon Levy, who is also a Moroccan Jew himself, has stated that he believes that the Holocaust was not central or identity sustaining for Moroccan Jews. And the quote is, "We have our own history, one that doesn't include the Holocaust." He said that in 2013. So the Holocaust obviously is a very central component of Jewish museums worldwide, and it's obviously is a large-scale traumatic event seen as very identity building, whether or not your country was affected directly by that occurrence. So it's arguable about the omission of Holocaust content, but the exclusion of content directly related to the mass Jewish exodus, which I referenced before, is a very firmly political curatorial choice, because that obviously directly affected the community. We go to the next slide. Two beautiful examples of Moroccan synagogues. So the Moroccan Jewish identity, as all Jewish identities, the point of this conference and a lot of other writing, as we all know, is very complex and layered within the scope of global Jewish identity specifically. So the demarcations between Ashkenazic populations, Sephardic populations, and Mizrahi populations are all arguably not very inclusive to Jews of North African descent. And that kind of indicates their peripheral position that they occupy in the Jewish consciousness. And so one popular narrative of the Jewish Moroccan experience that is seen in the Jewish Museum of Casablanca is that Muslims and Jews lived in total harmony and happiness, equal cultural interchange until the founding of Israel in 1948, and that Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel is to blame for the rift and everyone leaving. But the reality is that the Jewish community in Morocco held as many other Jewish communities worldwide, held a long-standing desire to immigrate to Israel before the creation of the State of Israel. So Simon Levy, the former director of the Jewish Museum of Casablanca, again, has stated that the omission of these details was in order to sort of comfort the audience of local Jews and make it seem like their decision to stay was more mainstream, more acceptable. But the omission of mass immigration is in the Jewish Museum of Casablanca is arguably partially at least due to the Moroccan government's support of the Jewish Museum of Casablanca, which I mentioned previously. So creating, again, a narrative of harmonious interchange and coexistence. Therefore, it is not the government's role in the Jewish community that is to blame for any leaving. It's the creation of the State of Israel. And Jews today, as I mentioned, are a fraction of the collective makeup of Morocco. But the state does continue to draw on the complicated Jewish legacy when it's politically or economically beneficial. And art is a central component of differentiation or exclusion. And visual culture can be a site for asserting national identities. And with the Jewish Museum of Casablanca, as with other Moroccan institutions with Jewish content, which I'll discuss in a second, the Moroccan state has asserted very definitively a history of religious plurality. But this is absolutely not to deny agency to the founders of the Jewish community, of the Jewish Museum of Casablanca, or to the Jewish communities there, or those who curate and direct the museum now, because I think we can all agree that having a Jewish museum is a wonderful thing, by and large. So if we want to go to the next one. I'll briefly talk about Moroccan tourism because it is a major element of Morocco's culture and economy. It's the fifth largest African economy by GDP, and that's due largely to kind of a comparative political stability when compared to other North African countries such as Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. Morocco has one of the longest standing monarchies and political systems in North Africa and in Africa and the Arabic world at large. And Morocco did retain a very strong monarchy during the Arab Spring, which many other countries did not. So it's seen as a more politically stable place. And that stability is also bolstered by the image of three cultures that live harmoniously together historically: the Muslims, the Jews, and the Berbers. And museums really do play an important role in tourism for the country. The government is expanding the number of museums there currently. There's over 20, which is quite unusual for North African countries, and 15 of those are state-run, and the rest private. Plan Azur was an investment project started in 2010 by the government, which mainly focuses on building tourist resorts, but does include cultural funding and in developing infrastructure for art. This is the Mohammed VI Museum of Contemporary Art in Rabat, which was founded in 2015. And museums can evoke ideas of modernity, of shifting cultures, and can be directly tied to pursuing foreign investments and trade. And the U.S. has entered into several trade agreements with Morocco, and the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Zoellick in 2004, in a New York Times opinion piece titled "When Trade Leads to Tolerance," opened with the discussion of Tangier's Museum of Antiquities, which does include Jewish-made art, and cited Morocco as the bright light of reform and moderation in the Islamic world. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about Jewish content in other museums besides the Jewish Museum. The differences in content between public and private museums in Morocco and their international and national audiences is partially due to the fact that Morocco arguably does not have a historically significant museum-going culture, and that kind of contributes to overall low visitor statistics to most museums. But based on the displays in multiple Moroccan museums, the Moroccan government has intentionally allowed museums with Jewish content to be outsourced, quoting Almar Baum again, to a private sector, which can be seen when comparing some museums, public and private, that contain references to Judaism. And this outsourcing of Moroccan Jewish history allows for the representation of multiculturalism to exist for international tourists, while keeping little outward involvement by the state in these institutions as to avoid controversy. The delineation between public and private museums in Morocco is much more nebulous than the US or the UK. And so even though Jewish Museum of Casablanca is a private museum, as I mentioned before, it's still influenced and funded and sort of controlled by the government in certain ways. So I have two examples here, the Berber Museum, which is on the right, and the Marrakesh Museum on the left, which are examples of a contrasting approach and outsourcing of content. So I'll talk about the Berber Museum first. It's located in Marrakesh in the Marjorel Gardens. It's a major tourist destination. And on the outskirts of the gardens, which were founded by Yves Saint Laurent, is the Berber Museum. It was opened in 2011, so fairly recently, and it houses more than 600 objects, including a lot of jewelry. It's a 3-room, beautifully designed little museum, and there's a huge display, which I very badly photographed here because you're not really supposed to take pictures, so it's rushed, I apologize, here of Berber Jewish jewelry. So this is a very strong representation of the Jewish community and Jewish art, and the English wall labels go into a detailed narrative about Jewish artisans and Jewish jewelry traditions of Morocco. It's really wonderful. The Marrakesh Museum is on the left, is located in the old city center in the Darmanabi Palace. It was constructed in the late 19th century and made into a museum in 1997. And the museum contains several small exhibitions within the rooms of the house that surround the courtyard that you see there, that pertain to traditional forms of Moroccan art. There's quite a few examples of jewelry, metalworking, and these pieces were often from the Atlas region, and they were artworks that virtually could have only been made by Jews or extremely, at the very least, been extremely influenced by traditions of Jewish metalworking. But none of the displays mentioned, they have wall labels as well, none of the displays mention Judaism, Jewish artisans, any kind of Jewish tradition or Jewish presence in Moroccan art. So we can see from this that multiculturalism is allowed to be discussed and seen in certain ways in Morocco, more openly engaging in kind of an erasure approach at state-sponsored museums, but very open at private institutions. Okay, these are 2 more pictures of the Berber Museum. It's really a beautiful, beautiful place. So there is a healthy market for museums in Morocco. There's a large number in the country, as I mentioned before, but there is a low influx of new objects at public museums in Morocco. Ethnic art or art objects created by artisans that are displayed for their ethnographic qualities. Oftentimes that kind of museum model values an unmoving, unshifting ideal of a historic, traditional, authentic visual culture, one that's constructed sometimes for Western audiences and doesn't allow for change or growth or progress development, kind of contemporary artworks and art forms. And as I mentioned, in the Jewish Museum of Casablanca, there are no pieces created after 1950, which is the date that corresponds to the mass immigration. The museum really does engage in kind of a construction of the past as the present. So it doesn't chart technological progresses of artistic techniques or styles, and instead kind of shows, as many of these museums do, show Jewish Moroccan art as a timeless monolith rooted in tradition and unable to kind of progress in any way. And the construction of new museums in Morocco showcase modernity and development. However, the contents don't always align, as in the Mohammed VI Museum of Contemporary Art in Rabat I showed earlier, the big, beautiful building. It's a very modern building. It receives mostly traveling exhibitions from European institutions like the Louvre, which is not to say that Moroccan visitors and audiences don't deserve or want or have interest in art that is not made in their own country. Rather, to kind of highlight how Moroccan art is seen, as with art from many Arabic countries, as seen as timeless and authentic. But there are a lot of contemporary Moroccan and Arabic artists who work outside of the traditional media. But their work is largely displayed in institutions abroad, in the US and the UK and Europe. And so state-run traditional museums, as we saw with the Jewish Museum of Casablanca, as well as the Marrakesh Museum, are oftentimes stagnant and kind of don't update their collections, and many curators in the country have expressed their frustration with the fact that when newly found items of historical importance are found, they're immediately sent to like the king's various palaces to decorate and not to museums to show the public. So this promotion of a multicultural image through museum programming and institutionalized diversity is kind of a calculated effort to project a certain image to a certain audience. But it's not without merit or benefits. As we all know, representation is extremely important, and it's positive to have a representation of Jewish and Berber cultures in many different institutions. So the JMC rather, is a productive presence in the cultural scene, and it does represent a unique community's self-definition in many ways, but it is impossible and unproductive to ignore the role of the state, as with any museum, and it is equally important to conduct a very thorough examination of motives and methods when depicting or positioning cultural plurality in any arena. Once again, to quote Omar Baum, he has stated that the Jewish Museum of Casablanca can be seen as a museum of reconciliation. So post-colonial representation of artistic objects, which is set in an idealized past with no contextualization of objects' relationships to recent cultural conflicts, such as mass immigration. Next one. This is just a beautiful object. I wanted to show another one. So in a statement on the Jewish Museum of Casablanca website, the current director, Jacques Toledano, who is originally of French origin, says that the JMC testifies to the plural identity of Morocco, which is a country of tolerance, again, that word tolerance, harmonious cohabitation between the Jewish and Muslim communities of Moroccan people. So this is an absolute insistence on a peaceful past, which is idealized history, basically. And it kind of forges new identities for Jews in Morocco and the Moroccan Jewish diaspora, such as those living in Israel. So the Moroccan government kind of sanctions and dictates this curatorial approach, this artistic approach to the visual display of art and culture that kind of doesn't really exist in the country anymore because the Jews basically mostly left. If you go to the next slide, this is one of the first things you see when you go into the Jewish Museum of Casablanca. It's a portion of Morocco's constitution, and I'll just quickly read it for you here. A sovereign Muslim state committed to its national unity and territorial integrity, the Kingdom of Morocco intends to preserve in its plenitude and diversity its one and indivisible national identity. Its unity, forged in the convergence of its Arab, Islamic, Amazigh, and Saharan Hassani components, has been nourished and enriched by its African, Andalusian, Hebrew, and Mediterranean tributaries. So again, drawing on this legacy of multiculturalism and religious plurality. So, in conclusion, I do want to restate that the Jewish Museum of Casablanca, for all its hidden nature and its very complicated kind of exhibition history, makes a very intense impact on the viewer. It's a wonderful museum, and if any of you ever go to Morocco, I highly recommend visiting. The culture, history, and art of Moroccan Judaism is worth a very detailed examination, and the ambiguity of the public support by the Moroccan government for Jewish initiatives is kind of indicative of the unique place that Moroccan Jews occupy in the national collective consciousness, which again is sort of a place between nostalgia, a romanticized past, true memories of cohabitation and suspicion and kind of demonization as well. So, as with global Judaism, a complicated presence. And the Jewish Museum of Casablanca's omission of content or mention of the community's mass immigration of Israel and of the Holocaust shows a curatorial strategy that echoes that ambiguity of Moroccan officials and of the public at large. But the Moroccan Jewish artwork, as we've seen a couple of examples of here in this presentation, around which these museums and institutions ostensibly revolve, is beautiful and unique and has a powerful history and appeal. And the Jewish Museum of Casablanca, as I mentioned again, is a completely unique institution, the only Jewish museum in the Arabic world. And examining the artwork and artisans of Moroccan Judaism is an illuminating and rewarding experience, one that serves to underscore the complexities and the richness of the community which it comes from. I have a partial bibliography on the next slide. Read any of that? Sorry, I didn't know it was going to be so small.